Good morning, everyone. My name is the Reverend William Levwood. My pronouns are he and him. It's so good to be together this morning. As we begin our service, if you're in person, I invite you to silence your phones. If you're at home, to close your other windows on your computer. Center yourself for worship by taking a deep breath. We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land, who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing, so that all together shall one day know full justice. So we've been talking about change. Last week, we talked about the way that keystone changes can make a difference that ripples out. We talked about that, how that can happen through relationships and through seeing the focus as... Turn on your mic. Oh, sorry. We talked about how keystone changes, like having your mic on, can ripple out or not having your mic on. How we can view the center of being as relationship rather than selfhood. How there can be spiritual practices like meditation or moving towards what's difficult. They can be keystone changes. And then, of course, we talked about climate change and the need to address climate change and how that calls us to just change everything. This week, we're going to look at how we might change our traditions, principally Thanksgiving. So we'll talk about that. And then, yay! Let's change it up. Let's re-envision it. We don't have to give it up, but we can re-envision it and bring it into today and what it needs to be today. So we'll talk about that today. And then next week, I don't know if you all have noticed, but I'm doing like in your life, the first Sunday that I'm in the pulpit of the month. Then I'm looking at how some present day or social justice application of it, and then we're going theological on the third Sunday. So next Sunday is a multi-generational service, but we're also going to look theologically at change and at how we need to change our relationship with the earth from a theological standpoint. So that's where we're going with things. And with that, let's light our chalice. We're going to light our chalice with words from Black Elk. They're in the hymnal, if you're curious. It's called The Sacred Hoop. We talked about a circle last Sunday. Then I was standing on the highest mountain of them all, and round beneath me was the whole hoop of the world. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in the sacred manner the shape of all things of the Spirit, and the shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that make one circle, wide as daylight and starlight, and in the center grew one mighty flowering tree.
Welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church on this beautiful, crisp autumn morning in this Thanksgiving week. My name is Sheila Doles, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm happy to be your worship associate today. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive community that seeks to create a more just and compassionate world. If you're new to Accotink and would like to talk more to us about our community, just about anyone here can tell you about us. Our greeters, our minister, myself, anyone with a cross-stitched name tag has been here for a while. Go ahead and talk to anyone. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, We encourage you to stay for our social hour, online and in person, immediately after this service. We're so delighted that you decided to join us today. Welcome. Perhaps the world ends here, a poem by Joy Harjo. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens and dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instruction on what it means to be human. We make men at it, we make women. At this table, we gossip, recall enemies, and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor, falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together again, once again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain and an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite.
So you might have noticed that Joy Harjo's poem ends speaking about the end of the world. In many Native American traditions, the world has ended and begun again, died and been reborn multiple times. So perhaps we should hear this last line of the poem in this context. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table could be interpreted like the REM song, "It's the end of the world as we know it." And perhaps we can feel fine about that, because perhaps that end is also a new beginning. A mentor of mine, a professor when I was at Star King School for the Ministry, the school's provost, a Sufi sheikh in the Chishti tradition, a professor at Howard before becoming a professor at Star King, Ibrahim Farajaje, may his memory be for a blessing, has written that as a historian of religion, he knows that ritual practices are always beginning anew, developing, morphing, growing, and changing over time. The world as we know it is constantly ending and beginning again, taking some of the past into the future, leaving some of it behind as new elements are added, taking some older elements and reinterpreting or transforming them. When I was at Star King, that was when I first heard the term Thanxgrieving. And I thought I knew what it meant. I thought that it meant keeping the gratitude while adding the grief specifically about the genocide of Native Americans and the stealing of their land. But only recently did I learn that there was more to it than that there was another element to the genesis of this idea of celebrating Thanksgiving. Ibrahim writes about this genesis in an essay. He begins by explaining that he and his partner, for much of their lives, lived far away from their families of origin. So just like the Friendsgiving that we explored last Sunday after church, they made families of choice with the people that were near them, the people they were connecting with, and they'd host a Thanksgiving meal for this extended family of choice. And for anyone who needed a place to be at table with others on the holy day. So initially, the grieving in Thanksgiving, even before it was called Thanksgrieving, was an element that was added to honor ancestors in these celebrations that Ibrahim and his family would put on, especially those ancestors who had died in the past year. Now, this was happening in the 80s and the 90s at the height of the HIV pandemic. So each year in particular, and Ibrahim was an activist for HIV awareness. So each year at Ibrahim's Thanksgiving table, they would pour libations and honor those beloved friends who had died the previous year from AIDS. Ibrahim writes that this addition to Thanksgiving, this transition into Thanksgiving, happened naturally in November, since Thanksgiving falls soon after the holy days of praying for the dead, All Souls Day in the Roman Catholic tradition, Dia de los Muertos in the Mexican tradition, and now we can add Transgender Day of Remembrance as well. Well then, in 1991, it happened that Ibrahim's best friend, Craig Gerard Joachim Harris, who Ibrahim describes as an HIV pioneer, a pro-feminist and pro-womanist, a writer extraordinaire, and one of the first people to challenge African American communities to become educated about HIV and to become communities of inclusion. Well, Craig died right before Thanksgiving in 1991. And Ibrahim, having just lost his best friend, didn't know if he was going to be able to host the Thanksgiving meal that year. He reached out to a friend and was confiding and being consoled by this friend, John Paul Hammond. He was sharing about the death of Craig, about how he didn't know if he could celebrate a day of gratitude while grieving, about how celebrating Thanksgiving in particular, a holiday that erases the true history of indigenous people in the United States of America, the terrorism inflicted upon them, the dispossession of their lands and homes, and their resistance and survival. He didn't know how he could celebrate this holiday when the world was still full of so much suffering of all kinds, poverty and oppression, economic and racial injustice, transphobia and homophobia. It's a long list, and we could add things to it. So Ibrahim and John Paul Hammond were consoling each other about the loss of their friend and the state of the world and wondering how to celebrate Thanksgiving when John Paul leaned over and whispered the word Thanksgrieving. And for Ibrahim, he writes, it held it all. That in that new phrase, he saw a way to give thanks for our multiple blessings, to express gratitude for all the gifts of the natural world, and to grieve the land stolen from people, and to move towards being in more right relationship with the earth, of acknowledging the many intersecting oppressions in the world, and also drawing strength from ancestors, both old and new. So that's what they did. That's what they did at that first Thanksgiving celebration right near here in the Brookland area of Washington, D.C. in the autumn of 1991. They made music together, they danced, they told stories, they grieved, and they celebrated blessings all together. Eventually, they had to move the celebration to Friday afternoon because many people wanted to join in as they continued year after year and had family obligations on Thanksgiving Day. So they moved Thanksgiving to Friday afternoon, which you might know is a holy time for Muslims. I imagine that had something to do with it for Ibrahim. So I want to encourage all of us to look at this example and think about how we can re-envision Thanksgiving. How we can re-envision it as Thanksgiving. It could be something simple, even a bit silly, like how writer and podcaster Hanif Abdurraqib, who didn't grow up celebrating Thanksgiving, on the evening before Thanksgiving, he always watches. For 20 years now, he's been watching the movie The Last Waltz, Martin Scorsese's concert documentary about the band's final concert, which was held on Thanksgiving Day in 1976. A few people know the band and the film. It could be a simple way of acknowledging the history of oppression and of resistance to that oppression, like how last year on Thanksgiving Day, my family took a walk to the James River to visit the new Emancipation and Freedom Monument on Browns Island, which had just been unveiled last year after the statue of Robert E. Lee was taken down from Monument Avenue a few weeks before that. So it could be something simple like that, especially since I'm giving you this idea on the 20th of November, but it could be something more ambitious. I want to share a more ambitious idea with you. What if we explore the idea, what if we imagine and begin to create a Thanksgrieving Seder? The Passover Seder was created after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem as a ritual of resistance and empowerment for the newly landless Jewish people, who were at that time dispossessed from their land as indigenous people in the Holy Land. Now, Ibrahim in that same essay says that part of any ritual is telling of its history, telling the story, and that's definitely true in the Passover Seder. That's the main feature of the Seder, is to tell the story of the liberation of the children of Israel from bondage and enslavement. And the Passover Seder ritualizes food to help in the story, the telling of that story. So what if we did a similar thing with Thanksgrieving? Joy Harjo's poem says that the world begins at the kitchen table. No matter what, she tells us, we must eat to live. The gifts of the earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. Just the other day, I was talking with my 9-year-old about this idea of having a Thanksgiving Seder, and my child said to me, "Dad, all we care about is the food." Well, the Passover Seder understands that, and so it imbues the food with special meaning. It's kind of like blending up vegetables and mixing them in with your mac and cheese, right? So we could do that with a Thanksgiving Seder. And while it doesn't have to follow the same pattern as the Seder, since that's the inspiration for this Thanksgiving Seder, why not look at the specific food symbols? So what if, in a Thanksgiving Seder, the matzah was corn or fry bread? And the symbolism was celebrating corn, which has to be cultivated and comes from this continent. What if we were celebrating that wonderful gift? Or with the fry bread, celebrating the resilience and adaptability that people have when met with hardship? What if the zeroah, the shank bone that's put on the Passover Seder table to symbolize the passing over of the children of Israel from the plague of the death of the firstborn? What if that was beans? Or turkey, also native to the Americas? Or venison, like what was actually eaten at that first Thanksgiving meal? Or perhaps salmon, so important to the Native American peoples of the Pacific Northwest? Or maybe a more sustainable fish, and an acknowledgement that we're overfishing. Or of course, it could be tofu or tofurkey. And the symbolism could be about survival and resilience, about the protein that we need to have strength, about the nitrogen that the beans give to the corn and the squash when they're planted together, as they are in Native American traditions, where they're called the Three Sisters. Or as fish can be added to the soil also to provide nutrients to help the plants grow. Maybe the beitzah, which in the Passover Seder is traditionally a hard-boiled egg to symbolize the circle of life and the newness of spring. What if that was a sweet potato? Or a pumpkin, or a squash, or just a potato? And what if, by having that there, we brought in those three sisters, the corn and the beans and the squash? The squash that protects with its thick roots and leaves, the beans and the corn when they're planted together. That would be a way in our Thanxgrieving Seder to honor the people of the Americas. Can anybody think what the maror, which is in the Passover Seder, bitter lettuce or horseradish, is there anything on the Thanksgiving traditional table that's kind of got a bitter or sourness to it? Cranberries, yeah. What if the cranberry relish was the maror, reminding us that life has bitterness and sorrow and sadness? And what if the karpas, the fresh greens, were collard greens or mustard greens or dandelion greens, as a way of celebrating the resilience of the people brought here from Africa and enslaved, the richness that comes from that culture and struggle through jazz and blues and soul and hip hop and soul food? And what if the haroset, that mixture of nuts and apples or dates and wine, what if that was pecan pie? Pecans are also, along with walnuts and sunflower seeds, native to the Americas. Something like 70% of the food that's eaten in the world originate in the Americas. So what if we ate pecan pie and remembered that pecans are a masting fruit? That means that they don't give their fruit every year. Because if they did, the animals would gather up all of the fruit and none of it would go to seed. So instead, they conserve their energy, and every third year or so, they throw out a huge bounty, more than the forest could possibly eat up, so that it both supports the animals through the winter, but also supports pecan trees and their survival. What if that reminded us of the oscillation of good times and hard times that is part of any life, part of the life of any family, of any culture, that research shows is a resilient narrative, unlike a narrative that says things are always getting better or always getting worse. A resilient narrative reminds us that sometimes there's abundance and sometimes there isn't. Now, I want to give a caution with this idea of developing a Thanksgrieving Seder or just new ways of celebrating and honoring Thanksgiving. And that caution is that we can't do it alone, and we kind of have to earn it. We have to actually be in relationship, in partnership, working for justice and transformation, addressing the griefs in the world in order to bring ourselves to a place of gratitude. Like we say in our land acknowledgement, to work towards healing until all people know full justice. And in that way, and by spreading this transformed Thanksgrieving idea to include people of all the cultures that share our country, maybe bringing in some of your own food traditions from your own families to the table, maybe then we can earn our way into this transformative way of celebrating and re-envisioning Thanksgiving. I hope we can as we build a new way. May it be so, and may we be among those who make it so. Amen, amen, amen.
Though we will extinguish our chalice flame, we carry within us what we kindled, the light of inspiration, the warmth of compassion, the fire of commitment. May we bring these gifts into our lives and share them radiantly out into the world. I invite you now to join me in our community blessing. You may extend your hands. At home, you may extend your hands towards the screen with these words of David Bumbaugh, This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity.
For our closing words, I'm going to paraphrase from another poem of Joy Harjo's, because I think they're appropriate today. She says, "Help us to keep on in this land of miracles, which is also the land of nightmares. Every act of kindness is a light of justice, is a light in the war for justice." She speaks of the intricate web, quivering, trembling, as we remember to the west, to the south, where we feasted and were given new clothes, to the west, where we gave up the best of us as food for the battle, to the north, where we were forsaken for our dreams, and to the east, because returned to us is the spirit of all we love. May it be so.